Welcome back. We're going to do part 2 of our conversation with Sebastian. We're going to talk about his excellent book called Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging. So I want to jump into it first. What got you interested in this topic?
So I had this interesting experience. I spent a year off and on with a platoon, American platoon, in combat in eastern Afghanistan. A very remote outpost. A lot of combat, a lot of hardship, a lot of danger, a lot of deprivation. Those guys couldn't wait to get back to Italy where they're based. They planned a big old party. You can imagine things they planned. And they got back. And after the party sort of subsided, I caught up with them in Italy. And I was really intrigued by the fact that most of them did not want to come back to the United States. They said if we could, we'd go back to Restrepo. This like flea-ridden, scorpion-ridden, like hellhole. No women, there was no television, there was no cooked food, there was no running water, there was no way to bathe. It was a brutal, the circumstances were brutal and they all missed it. And it made me think of something that, when I was young, I had a sort of uncle figure, a sort of mentor in my life named Ellis Settle, and he was half Lakota Sioux, half Apache. He grew up during the Depression, born during the Depression, grew up out west, educated himself incredibly well. He read everything that he could get his hands on. Brilliant, beautiful person. And I remember him telling me, this is how he phrased it. He said, you know, throughout the history of the United States, along the frontier, as he said, white people were always running off to join the Indians, but the Indians never ran off to join the white people. That everything, people given a choice, free people will go towards the tribal, towards the communal, and away from the modern. And that really stuck in my mind, and I wondered if it was true, and then I heard the soldiers saying basically the same thing, like, we don't want to go back to America. And what Ellis told me was that even people who had been kidnapped by the native tribes along the frontier and taken back and adopted into these societies, into these tribal communities, when given the chance to be repatriated to their family, to their native country, they would often refuse. They'd go into hiding. The last thing they wanted to do was come back to America. And I just thought, what's going on? Like something's wrong. And then I started to look into it. And what I found, to my surprise, actually it wasn't to my surprise now that I think of it, that as wealth goes up in society, as modernity goes up, the suicide rate goes up. As things get easier, people are more likely to kill themselves. As things get easier, people are more likely to be depressed. As things get easier, people are more anxious. As things get easier, people are way more likely to have PTSD. The PTSD rate in modern affluent societies is way, way higher than in poor societies. The Kurdish Peshmerga, the Afghan fighters, the Iraqi fighters, they don't even know what it is. I mean, they really are quite puzzled by this phenomenon that American soldiers talk about. PTSD rates in Israel are 1%. In our military, it's around 15 to 20%, which is odd because only 20% of our military is engaged in any combat whatsoever. Something's going on. And I developed this theory that maybe a certain amount of what we call PTSD, maybe a certain amount of all of this is due to the fact that it's actually quite stressful to live a independent individual life. We're a social species, we're social primates. We evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to live in tight-knit groups of 40, 50, 100, 150 people. The proximity of others buffers us from psychological stress. If you traumatize a rat and put it in a cage by itself, a week later, its trauma symptoms will be unchanged. If you traumatize a rat and put it in a cage with other rats, within a week, its behavior is indistinguishable from the other rats, right? So what seems to be happening is that soldiers, among others, are traumatized in a group. Trauma usually happens to groups of people, right? Or often happens to groups of people. the shooting in Vegas, that was a group of people being traumatized, right? It happened to them in a group. The problem for those people is that that group is not a community, right? That group is not the Lakota. That group is not 2nd Platoon Battle Company, right? For that matter, that group isn't even Google. It's just a bunch of people that got traumatized as a group, and they will now disperse and try to recover on their own. And on their own means in their air-conditioned apartment, in an apartment building, or in a single-family home in a cul-de-sac in a suburb where people may or may not know their neighbors. They definitely don't depend on their neighbors. They may not like their neighbors, but mostly their neighbors don't matter one way or another in terms of how they're going to get through, how they're going to survive another day, another year. Now, for most of human history, when you wake up in the morning and you look around, the people you see around you are the people that you depend on for survival. That's no longer true. That provides a great liberation from the group, but it also deprives us of our most powerful weapon against psychological troubles. And what I found was that when you collapse modern society, I mean, ironically, when you collapse it with 9/11, or the Blitz in London, or a hurricane, or what have you, when you collapse modern society, we very naturally revert to that sort of communal group commitment, that communal group loyalty. It happens very, very naturally, even in a modern American city like Houston after the hurricane. I live in New York City. After the attacks of 9/11, the suicide rate went down in New York, not up, it went down. Trauma is supposed to lead to suicide. What's going on? It's a totally traumatized city. It was a traumatized city, but because we were traumatized, everyone knew that they were needed, that their people needed them. And when you give people a task, like, you know what, you can kill yourself later, but right now we actually need you, right? When you do that, people are so grateful, it makes them feel so good to be needed, to be necessary, that they actually enjoy improved psychological health. So during the Blitz in London, the English government was convinced that there'd be mass psychiatric casualties when the German Air Force started bombing London flat every night, killed 30,000 people. What happened? Admissions to psych wards went down during the Blitz and then back up when the bombing stopped, right? And one amazed official said, he said, we have the chronic neurotics of peacetime driving ambulances. You give people a task, a job, and they will forget their own troubles. And therein lies a great, sort of great comfort for them, actually.
Can you talk about the effect of 9/11, how it had on PTSD rates for veterans and also the murder rate in the area?
Yeah, so in New York after 9/11, the suicide rate went down, but a lot of other things went down. The violent crime, the murder rate went down in New York. And Vietnam veterans who suffered from PTSD from Vietnam, most people don't wind up with long-term PTSD. I mean, that, from car accidents or violent attack. I mean, it's not just soldiers that get traumatized by violence, right? I mean, there's trauma everywhere in society. And only around 20% of people wind up with a long-term problem. Well, these Vietnam vets were in that 20% that decades later were still suffering from PTSD. And they said that as soon as 9/11 happened, they stopped experiencing their symptoms because, boom, they're back on the battlefield. What a relief. People need me. I can ignore my own troubles and, help the group, help other people. And that feels incredibly good. When people are, one of the sort of sad ironies of modern society is that we are so affluent and so safe that individually none of us are ever needed by the society, right? I mean, the society continues on fine without us. We're never asked, our country and our community never ask anything from us because they never need us, right? We have a fire department, we have a police department, we have farmers that grow our food, we have people who drill for oil and get killed doing that. We got loggers cutting trees down. We got commercial fishermen catching fish. Everyone's dying. I mean, people die doing those jobs. They're dangerous jobs. They're more dangerous than most of the units in the U.S. military, except the really forward frontline units. We don't have to deal with any of it. And because we've subcontracted out all of these things that society needs, none of us have to step up. Until there's a crisis, until there's an emergency, none of us have to step up and actually contribute our time, run risks, contribute our resources to helping other people, until there's a hurricane that hits a city, and all of a sudden people are looking for any kind of boat they can get their hands on to go rescue other people. The so-called Cajun Navy that was motoring through the streets of Houston saving people, they weren't making distinctions of like Republicans and Democrats. They weren't just saving Republicans, right? They weren't making distinctions of white and black or rich and poor. They were just saving people. And there was an incredible unity that happened there that maybe will linger or maybe won't, I don't know, but there was incredible unity there and an egalitarianism. I mean, the terrible sort of class distinctions in London, in England, collapsed during the Blitz. Like everyone's sleeping shoulder to shoulder in the tube stations. There's no rich or poor there. Bombs don't care if you're rich or poor, they'll kill you. They'll bury you in rubble. And so that egalitarianism is actually intoxicating. And as a result, people really miss those days when everyone was equal. And I studied one earthquake in Italy, in Avezzano, and one of the survivors said, understand that in that area, if I'm remembering correctly, 96% of the population was killed instantly. They were basically hit by a nuclear weapon, right? And the people that survived were on their own for days until the government got there. And the survivor wrote about it and said that the earthquake had produced what the law promises but cannot in fact deliver, which is the equality of all men, of all people. Then the government got there, supplies got there, and immediately the stratification resumed, the social stratification resumed.
I was going to have you read that quote next. So perfect timing. Can you talk about the beauty and tragedy of safety and how we lose the rites of passage because of it?
Yeah, so humans evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in a pretty dangerous environment, living in a small-scale society in small groups where people knew each other pretty well. In that natural world, understand that humans, we're very vulnerable. It's sort of anatomically vulnerable. We don't have long, sharp claws. We don't have sharp teeth. We can't run very fast. We can't climb trees worth a damn. We are really, we're really vulnerable in the natural world, except that we coordinate and collaborate very, very well. We know how to make weapons. We know we can speak to each other. We can coordinate. We can strategize. We can act in unison, and we have a loyalty to each other that will get us to even sacrifice our lives to help other people. Other animals don't do this. We're the only species where an individual will risk their life or sacrifice their life to help a same-sex peer. I don't mean their spouse. I don't mean their kids. I mean another male, for example, that you're not related to, and you throw yourself on the hand grenade, and that guy survives, and that guy has kids, and you don't, and in Darwinian terms, you're a failure. But humans do that. No other animal species, even chimpanzees, don't do that. That makes us very, very potent. Sort of tactically potent. When you have a group of people that are all willing to do that, you can really defend yourselves well. And that's what human beings are. So you have to, if you're in a fight, most of the hunting and fighting was done by young males, sort of organized by older, experienced males, just like the U.S. military, right? Just about every military. But how do you know if you're going to go into combat and you're going to risk your life to help that guy? How do you know that he's going to risk his life to help you? What you need is a very, very deep loyalty to the idea of that group, so that even if I know you hate my guts or I don't like you, that has nothing to do with my willingness or your willingness to protect each other. And that group affiliation that overrides our personal feelings is absolutely essential to the sort of small group dynamics that combat and hunting depend on. So how do you figure that out before the test, before the first firefight? You need to know this before the first shots ring out, before the first arrows fly, before the tiger charges the group, right? You need to know this before. The way you find out is through initiation rites. And if you're not willing to go through whatever tortures the humiliations and whatever else that I can devise to test, to challenge your identity as an autonomous person, I'm gonna break your idea of individuality. I'm gonna make it clear that you belong to this group and that you will go through anything for this group. And if you're not willing to do that, I don't want you in the group. I can't trust you. Because when the chips are down, you might make a decision that's just to save yourself at the expense of others. So in that case, fine, go in peace, but you're a danger to this group. So we don't. So initiation rites are very, very important for bringing young males into this sort of group that will be doing something extremely dangerous, where everyone's in a lot more danger if there's any weak link in the chain where you can't rely on that person. And there's, it's not done in a formal way, but part of sort of boot camp and all that stuff is a sort of process of weeding out the people who are not committed to doing absolutely anything that's asked of them on behalf of the group.
When you're talking about training initiation, it reminded me of, I was watching a History Channel video on Bud's training. You guys probably seen it. And there's the Hell Week scene, and it shows this guy they're trying to get in these rafts and put them against current and then take them down and whatnot. And there's this one guy who has a broken leg, and he's crawling, trying to get back with his team. He's literally crawling on a broken leg so he can get to where he needs to go. And he's just that unbelievably committed to the whole entire group. And it was just almost like a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very ancient human behavior. And it's not like everyone has to be like that, but the people that are in the fighting group that's defending the society, they need to be like that. They absolutely have to be like that. Right. I mean, there's one guy, Brendan, my friend Brendan from 2nd Platoon, said to me at one point, we were on an ambush, we were sort of sitting on this hillside and we were pretty bored, and he said, he was sort of musing, it was towards the end of the deployment, he was sort of musing about this whole weird experience he just had. And he said, it's really strange. There's guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we'd all die for each other. And then he thought about it and he said, so how much do you really hate each other? It's true.
Yeah. When you were talking about the hurricanes, I remember since the election, every other story in news about how politically divided we are in this country. But then I remember seeing a picture of a human chain, and it was people holding hands, old, young, black, white, Trump supporters, Trump haters or whatnot, and they're all reaching out to an SUV to save someone who's in the car.
Yeah, right.
I wonder, is there possible ways for us to bring about those feelings without having to go through that strife? Or does this strife necessary for us to get into those situations?
Well, I mean, the problem is the two political parties are very much invested in not having that happen, right? I mean, their most reliable political strategy is to trigger the loyalty and vehemence of their base. That is it works, right? I mean, when you energize your base, you win elections, and so and you can't your base energizing your base, right? Energizing your base depends on this narrative of villainizing the other guy's base. They're like, there isn't room for two bases in this town, right? There's the real way, the right way, the American way, and then there's the other way. And both sides are saying that, right? So both parties, the GOP, I mean, I happen to be a Democrat, right? And I'm Democrat because I think the GOP is acting slightly worse than the Democrats. And when the Democrats act a little worse than the GOP, I'm going to become a Republican. If that happens or not, I don't know. But that's the sort of basis for my politics. And right now, I think both parties are acting extremely badly. And they have decided that their political future does not lie in getting Americans to focus on what unites us all. It lies in demonizing the other side and saying this is the only honorable way to do things, the only American way to do things. And both sides engage in it, and it's disgusting. And honestly, when people say, he's not my president, you are saying a deeply undemocratic thing when you say that. He is your president. He was elected by the people. Like, I mean, maybe in another country he's not your president, but if you're an American, you may not like him. I don't like him, right? But he's my president. He was elected, right? And that the DNC is not openly rejecting that sentiment as undemocratic and undermining of our national ideals is disgusting. And that the GOP, when Donald Trump engaged in a 7-year-long campaign to convince the American public that Barack Obama was not a US citizen, that the commander-in-chief was issuing orders to our military, was actually an imposter, right? And that the GOP never denounced that. It never said, at least to the troops, hey guys, hey everybody over there, listen, your president is not an imposter. He is actually an American citizen. Don't worry about what this idiot's saying. That the GOP never said that is absolutely revolting. I mean, it puts soldiers and veterans in an untenable position of following orders of someone that shouldn't be in office. Like, I mean, their jobs are hard enough as it is. And I can't believe that the GOP never renounced that stupid idea. And so, very clearly in my mind, like the last thing the two political parties want is a long line of people that are risking their lives, black, white, rich, poor, tall, short, everything, risking their lives like to save one of their own. Like that's the last thing the parties want. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's the only way I can explain the partisan rhetoric that is coming. I mean, I don't think the population is naturally partisan. I think they're naturally like that chain of people in the floodwaters, right? They want to be like that, right? And it's the only way I can explain the behavior of our political parties in trying to divide us, that they must see some political gain in doing so. And I think they should all be locked up and put in prison. I mean, seriously, for doing that to this country, I think it's absolutely disgusting.
Right. I remember when McCain was running against Obama in, I want to say it was 2008, sorry. And some person grabbed a mic and said Obama was not born here or a Muslim. Yeah. And McCain right away took the person's mic and said, no, that's incorrect or whatnot. Yeah. And it just seems that with the whole tribal identity to what group you're on, it's if you go against their talking points, you're immediately looked at as a traitor. And it's just,
that's right. Yeah. No, that was an incredibly honorable thing that McCain did. And he answered that question with more dignity and more honesty than Hillary Clinton did, who's of the same political party. I mean, she was asked the same thing, and she sort of hedged on it. Like, yeah, I don't know if he's a Christian or not. He says he is, whatever it was. And, and she's a Democrat, right? And I mean, so, it's just like, I can't believe it. I don't think people want that for this nation. I mean, some do. Some percentage does, I mean, they're marching with tiki torches, those people do, but that's about it.
So after the bombings, the Blitz or whatnot, you mentioned that the politics kind of changed for Great Britain for like 20, 30 years. Can you go into that?
Yeah, I mean, apparently I think what would be derided as the sort of modern welfare state in Britain started with the collective suffering and collective solutions that were, typical of the Blitz, and then the sort of caretaking that the nation had to undergo of itself, of the most vulnerable people in the English population after the war. That created a sort of state society where there was a lot of welfare, a lot of state aid, a lot of medical care, and that came out of. I mean, the politicians that espoused those views came out of the Blitz and understood that the society needed to take care of itself and devote resources to taking care of people who were very vulnerable. And that ended with Maggie Thatcher, and in this country with Ronald Reagan. I mean, both of those people had absolutely legitimate political views, and I think we're probably right about a lot of stuff. But it did mark a radical change in how we understand our society. And for a full generation, we saw society as something whose main purpose was to take care of the society, and then after that it became something else, something that had advantages and disadvantages, but definitely was a departure.
Can we talk about the coal miner story in Europe and the gender roles and what was going on in that coal mine?
Yeah, so there was a coal mine disaster in Canada in the 1950s. and basically they had something called a bump. It was an explosion. There's something in the coal dust that's very volatile and can explode, and the mine shafts collapsed. They pancaked, and they killed, scores and scores of people that were sort of trapped in these collapsed passageways. And they trapped something like 18, I can't remember exactly, it's not like 18, 15, 16, 17, 18 people deep, deep underground, like 2 miles down. I mean, what a nightmare, right? Like you're 2 miles down in the earth, everything's collapsed above you. You have no idea if anyone's ever going to be able to get to you. You have no water, no food. People are injured. And you have, 24 hours worth of lamplight or battery life in your lamps, right? I mean, talk about a nightmare. So what happened was, in the immediate aftermath, those guys, it was all men down there, those guys didn't know if the collapsed passageways were, if they dug through 100 feet of rubble and then they're in the clear again, they could leave, or was it, a mile of collapsed passage? They had no idea. So on the chance that they could dig their way out, they started digging. And the people this is a very traumatized group of men, right? And so the people that came to the fore, they weren't necessarily crew bosses or anything. They didn't have an official role as leaders, but they were very aggressive men who were like, grabbed a pickaxe, grabbed a shovel, started shouting orders, dig here, we're going to do, they didn't care how people felt. Some guys were scared, some guys were hurt, some, they didn't care, right? They're like, we got to dig now. It didn't work. They could not dig their way out. And they ran out of water, and they ran out of food, and then they ran out of light. And eventually they were just sitting there in the darkness and maybe facing the prospect that for the rest of eternity they'd be buried 2 miles down in the earth, never to be dug up even as corpses. And so, of course, now the struggle becomes not physical but psychological. And what they needed was a different type of leader. They needed a leader who actually was not aggressive, who was not a go-getter. They needed someone who was empathic, who was able to sort of take the temperature of the group to see who was suffering so much that they might trigger a panic in the whole group, who needed help, who didn't, who had a little, who could go without their little sip of water that day, who needed that extra sip to get by. So there were people that really needed these sort of communicative skills, these empathic skills, who was focused on the unity of the group rather than on following orders. And so what psychologists who studied these people when they got them out, right? And they had to make terrible decisions. And when one guy was pinned, his arm was crushed between 2 timbers, and he couldn't move. And they were trying to figure out whether to take, one of the carpentry saws or an axe and, cut him free. I mean, there were decisions like that had to be made in the darkness, imagine, right? So what the psychologists found was that the first kinds of leader, the really aggressive kind that didn't care how anyone felt, that was a very classically sort of male role, right? It was a very kind of male form of leadership. But you needed more than that in a society that has to deal with a lot of different challenges, and some of them being emotional challenges. You can't just go with that guy, right? That's super important in a crisis. But in sort of longer terms, you also need someone who's empathic, who's concerned with the unity of the group, who wants people to communicate better and all that stuff. A classically female role. And what these psychologists found, which is, in some ways entirely in keeping with this whole philosophy of sort of transgender today, is that gender roles don't depend on sex. You can have females acting in a, quote, male role as leader, or you can have males acting in a, quote, typically female role as leader. The sex doesn't matter. What does matter is that these 2 different kinds of leadership roles that we have called typically male and typically female, you can call them whatever you want, but that is what we have always called them. The important thing is that whether it's a male or a female filling these roles, you do need both of these roles filled. And anyone can do it. You are not bound by your sex in terms of what role you can play. And so that, that to me was like this amazing story, because it both confirmed the idea that society needs different kinds of gender roles in order to function harmoniously and safely and well. And it showed that those gender roles are not dependent on sex. I mean, it sort of made the case for both things that are true.
Can you talk about the sachems, and then also how our presidency tries to put those two into one, which kind of creates schizophrenia? Yeah.
So the Iroquois were really a very modern, in some ways modern state. I mean, they were a small scale agricultural and hunting society in upstate New York, but they created these incredible alliances that reached all the way out to the Great Plains. There's a theory that had Europeans shown up on the East Coast 100 years later, that the Iroquois might have been so evolved that they could not have fought their way. I mean, that they could not have gained a foothold in North America. Who knows? But their government was really, really interesting. They had women in positions of great power. Women chose leaders, and they had two different kinds. And the American Constitution was based in part on the Iroquois. I think it was called the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, and it was a document. It was an understanding that defined the individual's rights within Iroquois society. It's an extremely enlightened way of thinking, and we adopt Thomas Paine and some of the other people, the intellectual creators of American independence, used these Iroquois ideals as part of what they understood to be the natural rights of man and how they're incorporated into society. But at any rate, one of the interesting things about Iroquois society is that they had war leaders and peacetime leaders. And as soon as there was a war with another tribe, as soon as there was an enemy, war leaders took over. And they had absolute authority over absolutely everything. And if peace were going to be negotiated with the enemy, if they got to the point of negotiating a peace, once the peace was ratified, the war leaders instantly lost all authority, and the governing of the tribe shifted over to peacetime leaders. And the peacetime leaders were partially elected by women and could be women. War leaders were not. War leaders were men. But as soon as the conflict was over, so as not to risk a wartime mentality governing a peacetime society, so as not to risk that, instantly, as soon as the peace was ratified, it shifted over to the peacetime leaders. And I read a wonderful book about the rise of fascism in Europe in the 30s. And this guy, I can't quite remember his name, he's an wonderful American writer. He made, of the time, I mean, he was sort of documenting it in real time. Whitaker, his name was Whitaker. He said that fascists, what they did is they convinced a peacetime society to operate as if they were at war. And that was the brilliance of fascism. They would take a country that was at peace, like Germany or Italy or Spain, and convince it. They would convince the population that wartime measures were necessary even though there was no enemy. And that's what fascism is. They were making a mistake that the Iroquois were not making.
And we have the position of president. It's like this conflict and peace at the same time in one brain. It's like, how do you maintain that?
Right. I mean, and our system has its advantages and disadvantages, but the Iroquois would say, for what it's worth, the Iroquois would say, it's crazy. I mean, it's just different. Just different kinds of people that can run a war and can run a peace. I mean, you certainly don't want someone who's oriented towards peace commanding troops. And you really don't want someone whose orientation is war and commanding troops to try to figure out a fair and civil society. It's insane.
You also mentioned the vital tension between liberal ideas and conservative ideas for the society. Yeah,
so one of the ideas in my book Tribe, and that I've sort of explored a little bit after writing that book in my research, is the idea of this sort of false argument between liberals and conservatives. And the false argument is based on the premise that one side's right and one side's wrong. And each side, of course, thinks it's right. The truth is, if you look at our evolution, if you look at human genetics, if you look at twin studies that have studied this, I mean, they know from twin studies that genetics determines about 50% of your political belief, right? So if you're liberal or conservative, about 50% of that belief comes from a genetic predisposition. And they know that because genetically identical twins are far more likely to have a far higher concordance of political opinion than fraternal twins that don't share identical DNA. And the only explanation for that is that genetics plays a role. If genetics plays a role in political opinion, that means that conservatism and liberalism in its basic forms, I don't mean Democrats and Republicans, I mean in very basic human norms of conservatism and liberalism and the sort of particular concerns that each holds, that those ways of seeing, two different ways of seeing the world were adaptive, had survival value in our evolutionary past. Or it wouldn't be encoded in our DNA, right? I mean, the stuff that's encoded in our DNA had survival value. And the fact that altruism, that generosity feels good is adaptive, right? I mean, what it meant is in Darwinian terms, people that act with generosity and altruism towards the group immediately around them, that those people had a higher survival rate than groups of people that didn't think that way and act that way. That's all that means. So it means that conservatism in its sort of basic orientation, that unknown people, strangers, foreigners are suspect. They may hurt us. We don't necessarily want to let them into our group. The idea in a strong hierarchy and sort of law and order within the society, people who aren't working hard enough, that's really their problem. We don't have to bail them out if they're not willing to participate in the group. Like that sort of basic conservative ethos, whether you agree with it or not, has very ancient evolutionary roots and clearly served to help our ancestors survive. Likewise, liberalism, which is, with its deep concern for fairness, for having an egalitarian society where high-ranking people, high-ranking males can't abuse lower-ranking people, where the vulnerable are taken care of, whether they're contributing to society or not, like where strangers, foreigners, are not seen as a threat, but as a source of new ideas, new kinds of food, new ways of thinking. Like that basic liberal ethos also contributed to our survival. Or those ways of thinking would not be encoded in our DNA and passed on with twins showing higher concordance than everybody else. That means that those two sort of opposing ideas, a society that has only one or only the other is incredibly vulnerable. And that we survive best when those opposing ideas exist in a dynamic tension with each other, and we arrive at some middle ground that incorporates the best ideas of both into one coherent ethos. That's what that means. So now in Washington, with this stupid idea that negotiation and compromise is bad, they're dirty words, that the other side is not only wrong, but immoral and un-American. Like those idiotic ideas that are now current in Washington and current right on up to the White House, unfortunately. Those ideas are absolutely, utterly in contradiction to our evolutionary past. They make absolutely no evolutionary sense, no scientific sense whatsoever. And it's pretty clear that a society that is at war with itself, politically, morally, economically, culturally, a society that's at war with itself and thinks that the other side shouldn't even be part of the union? Tell me a marriage that has survived that operates like that. I cannot think of one, right? And that is the danger that this country is under. We are not going to we're a powerful country. We're the most powerful country in the world. We are not going to get taken down by bullets fired by somebody else. If this country, if this incredible democratic experiment that we are ever fails, ever ends, ever collapses, it will not be from bullets. from other people. It will be something we did to ourselves and that we did with words. That's the danger of partisanship. And it makes partisanship actually a national security issue. I mean, partisanship is more dangerous to this country than Al-Qaeda, far more dangerous. And it makes it a national security issue. And I wish Congress would see it like that and form a committee devoted to somehow ending the partisanship that's destroying this country, because it will destroy this country. Probably faster than we realize.
I mean, that was the original fear of the founders, or the party system.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want people to form blocks and stop thinking about the good of the nation instead of the good of the party.
Right, and the thing is, the parties reflect our evolutionary past, but the parties, up until now, the parties more or less disagreed with the other side while they kind of respected its right to exist. Like I disagree, I'm a Democrat, I disagree with a lot of Republican thought, but I'm glad it exists, at least so I can have someone good to argue with. You know what I mean? I mean, conservatives are what make liberals. Like without conservatives, liberals don't exist. Conservatives don't exist without, we need each other. We exist in opposition to the other, but that means that we sort of respect we disagree with the other side, but respect that it has its own coherent ethos, and that the other side actually thinks that way because the other side thinks that's what's best for the country, right? The idea that the other side thinks that way because it's trying to destroy the country, that idea is completely toxic. It would never be that kind of contempt for someone you disagree with. Disagreement's fine, argument's fine, it makes for sort of strong solutions, I think. But contempt for someone you share a combat outpost with doesn't last very long. Like that, no one, out at Restrepo, there were guys who really disliked each other, but no one had contempt for anyone else. Like you don't want to have contempt for someone who you may be counting on to put a tourniquet on your femoral artery bleed, right? And that's what we're doing in this country, is like we have contempt for people we may actually depend on for our lives. We don't know if or when this country will be turned into one huge combat outpost. We have no idea when that's going to happen. It happened in Houston, and everyone acted well. But we're really gambling with this country of sort of institutionalizing this partisan rhetoric where we actually have a kind of deep loathing for half the country. Like, are you insane? Like, that doesn't work.
Yeah. Can you talk about, you mentioned moral courage, and then there was another courage which was like more of like saving someone if they're about to die or whatnot?
Yeah, so from studies of sort of bystander rescues from fires and other catastrophes that happen sort of spontaneously in the world, what they know from the statistics of these incidents is that the vast majority of, 98% or something like that, of people, bystanders who spontaneously expose themselves to danger to rescue people they don't know who are in a burning building or whatever, almost 100% of the people that do that are male, particularly young male. And they will risk their lives, particularly for children, in this order: for children, for young women, for old people, and eventually for young men. Young men are the last to get, they're the first to rescue and the last to get rescued, as they should be. Young men are unbelievable, in genetic terms, are very replaceable in society. Young women are not. The constraint on the health of a society is the number of young women, not the number of young men, which is one of the reasons that young men are sent into, the sort of meat grinder of World War I. Like if the troops in World War I had been young women, the Europe wouldn't exist anymore, right? It would be over. Europe recovered quite quickly from World War I because it was almost exclusively young males that were getting killed. Had it been millions of young women, we would still be seeing the consequences of that in the demographics over there. So those are the statistics. Like it or not, those are the statistics. People freely using their free will, walking down the street, whether to risk their lives to save someone or not, it's almost 100% male. That doesn't mean that men are braver than women at all. It doesn't mean that at all. There are different kinds of courage, and there's also moral courage that does not depend on sort of a physical reaction. So men are adapted to that kind of physical feat. On average, we're 20% larger and stronger than women are on average. But there are moral decisions that don't depend on physical strength. So during World War II, a very serious decision that families had to make was the Germans are coming. Here's this Jewish family we don't even know. They just showed up in our driveway. Are we going to hide them in the basement? We're Gentiles. We don't have a problem with the Nazis. We're fine. But here's this Jewish family. They're fleeing the Germans. Do we hide them or not? If we hide them, they may survive. We don't know them. We don't owe them anything. They just showed up. If we hide them, they may survive. If we hide them and the Germans discover that, everybody's dead. So women were significantly more likely to make that morally courageous choice of hiding a family of people they don't know who would be killed by the Nazis. More likely than men were, right? It didn't require scaling a burning building, running, jumping onto the railroad tracks to help someone with the train. It didn't require a physical act. Men, frankly, are more adapted to that kind of physical act. But it required incredible courage, and that's moral courage. And it's equally important, and you can't have a humane and civil society if people are not willing to act with moral courage. And moral courage doesn't just mean sacrificing your life. It may mean sacrificing your career. It actually may mean standing on principle and saying, I cannot abide this. I'm stepping down. I'm not running for Senate next year or whatever. There's things, there's principles that I have that I value more than my career, more than my party, more than anything. And I'm going to, as Martin Luther said, here I stand for I can do no other. That's moral courage. It doesn't have to be life and death.
Can we talk about reintegration of veterans into our society? You mentioned World War II had much more casualties than what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan. Yet PTSD rates were much higher in Iraq, Afghanistan than they are after World War II.
Yeah, so we're social primates. We clearly were adapted to recover from trauma because the natural world is incredibly traumatizing. Forest fires, floods, predators, enemies. If a significant proportion of human beings were psychologically incapacitated by trauma and could not function and had to be taken care of by everybody else, the human race wouldn't exist, right? One lion attack in the camp, everyone's incapacitated and curled up in the fetal position, and everyone starves, right? It can't work that way. We recover from trauma. We're survivors. We're an incredibly resilient species. We can survive virtually anything psychologically. It's extraordinary what we can survive. That psychological survival is greatly aided by the community of others. We have a very hard time. Traumatize a rat, put it in a cage by itself, the rat doesn't do very well. That's what we are, right? We're traumatized rats in cages by ourselves. And the problem with modern society is that we go into combat in groups, we come back individually, and we disperse to our single-family homes, our apartments, our stratified society where rich and poor are not in it together, the political parties aren't in it together, the races are not in it together, and everyone's living in these little cubby holes. That does not help our psychological adaptation to trauma. It doesn't help our healing. And so every generation, America has gotten wealthier and more individualized. So my wife is the youngest of 12 kids. Her dad was 55 when she was born. He fought in World War II. From North Africa to Sicily, Italy, south coast of France, all the way through France to Austria. The whole deal as a lieutenant and a captain. They just kept replacing men underneath him. He was wounded many times. I mean, a level of trauma that very few in the current wars, I think, have undergone. Thank God. He came home to his hometown, and he lived within a few blocks of his 6 brothers who had all also served. The transition from the battlefield to the home really wasn't much of a transition, because when those guys got home, everywhere they turned, there were other people who had been on the battlefield. It was a large-scale war that involved the entire country in one way or another. That's no longer true. I'm not saying that as a moral judgment, it's just reality. That's no longer true. We don't need a massive military like we did in World War II. That's great. There's a real upside to that. The downside is that when people come home, chances are they can't sit on their front porch and look around and say, that guy's a vet, that guy's a vet, that guy's a vet. If I'm feeling a little weird one day, I can just go over and knock on his door and we can have a beer together and talk about it. Like that's not possible anymore. The kind of community that happens on Facebook is better than nothing, but it's not community. It really isn't. It's a pale substitute for sitting on a porch and drinking a beer with somebody and really talking.
Do we have any audience questions?
So on that note, I had a question about technology's role in society and where you see that going. Because I know a lot of different ways you can take that, but one conversation that happens a lot out here is about the eventual obsolescence of human labor. And I mean, there's a robot mowing the lawn right now. So I think it's makes sense. But so what are your thoughts on just the general role of technology in society and people being able to feel needed?
I mean, in general, modern society requires less and less of the individual's input, and there's a real psychological harm there. There's one study I saw compare depression rates in North America, urban and rural North America, compared to urban and rural Nigeria. Nigeria, one of the poorest, most messed up, chaotic, and violent countries in the world. I've worked there. It's a very tough place to work. The lowest depression rates were rural Nigeria, which is also the poorest population. When people don't have a lot of resources, they have to act collectively, right? And in that collective action, they are buffered from their psychological troubles. In the wealthiest societies, there's very little collective action because everyone's wealthy enough to take care of everything. You know, instead of a neighborhood of 10 homes having one lawnmower that they share, everyone has their own lawnmower, right? That's great. It's also not great. So as you automate things, people need each other less and less, and just engage with each other less and less. And there's a real harm there. And so we know in the last 10, 15 years, suicide rates, depression rates, anxiety rates have all been going up. And I can't prove, I'm not interested in somehow proving that that's the effect of the internet and social media on our sort of collective mental health, but it is interesting to note. I mean, that it exactly coincides with young people shifting the central energy of their social interactions from one-on-one in the same room to online. Like the shift has happened in the last 10 years, and the anxiety rates in young people has skyrocketed, as has suicide and everything else. So I think the great lie of our generation is the phrase social media. It's really not social media. It's anti-social media. It has great applications. It's great for disseminating information, organizing people. I mean, the internet is amazing, right? Like, God forbid we lose it. All of human knowledge in this little machine, right? I mean, it's incredible. But I say it's anti-social media because when you put people in a group, when you put them in a room, you put them in a restaurant, they will ignore each other in order to pay attention to something that it basically is just ones and zeros on the screen. Like, if you saw 10 people, 10 friends, people who actually like each other, standing around all reading their own book, you would think these people need to be institutionalized. Like, there's something seriously wrong with them, right? That is not human behavior. That is not social behavior. And I think it's really costing young people psychologically.
I have an online question. You mentioned how important being part of a tribe is. What are some success strategies and methods folks can use to find the level of connection you discuss? It seems many groups and organizations fail to give most people the depth of connection they are seeking.
Yeah, I mean, a real tribal community is one that lives around you, that you depend on for your food, for your safety. I mean, it's a living group. I mean, in the classic sense of the word tribe. We're not going to burn down the suburbs, ban the car, and start living in sort of collective collective units in the, I mean, obviously, right? That's not what we're talking about as a solution. So how can we have it all? How can we live and enjoy the benefits of this modern society? And the benefits are enormous. I mean, you know, we need a whole other hour just to enumerate them. We're very, very lucky to live in this society in all kinds of ways. But how can we have that and reclaim some of the sort of communal energy and connection that clearly makes people feel good and that arises spontaneously in a crisis, like a war or a catastrophe? How can we have that thing, that communal thing, without the crisis, without the war? You have to do it proactively. You have to say, I want to make that happen. It'll happen naturally if we get slammed with a hurricane, but let's not wait for that. Let's make it happen. And I think there's a few things we could do. As a nation, the largest community we're part of is the nation, right? I think national service, mandatory national service with a military option. I think it's immoral to force someone to fight a war they don't believe in, but it's entirely moral to require that someone put some time and energy into this incredible collective experiment called the United States and democracy. I think it's entirely moral to require that. And I think it's quite healthful. I think it's good. It gives people a sense of belonging to something, a sense of meaning. It also mixes rich and poor, black and white, religious, non-religious. It mixes everybody up like the military does. It's one of the great things about the US military. It mixes everybody up and stirs them up and judges them on their behavior and not on their skin color or how much money they have or whatever else. That would be an amazing thing for this country. I mean, I defy the two political parties to divide us if we have all had 2 years of national service behind us and we know people from these other demographics that our leaders would want to demonize. Like, I defy the GOP and the DNC to divide us with that. The other thing, I think I think it would be extremely important as a people to demand that our politicians refrain from contemptuous rhetoric. I mean, rhetoric that undermines our sense of unity as a nation. It's protected under free speech. Free speech is sacred. You don't want to mess with that. But that doesn't mean that kind of really toxic partisan rhetoric shouldn't be condemned. And I think if we asked our government to form a committee that would examine toxic partisan rhetoric and condemn it in a bipartisan way, that would actually communicate a lot to the rest of this nation that we are actually that we are a nation. People who have harmed this country really, really badly, like the dozen or so mostly white men who collapsed the economy in 2008, that you can harm this country that badly and not pay any consequence means we're not a nation. Bo Bergdahl betrayed this country. He might spend life in prison. I don't think he harmed the country in a material way, but he certainly betrayed us. He might spend his life in prison. The dozen or so men who collapsed our economy and cost us all $14 trillion, not one of those guys was even indicted. What's that communicate to us as whether we're unified, we're a tribe or not? Of course we're not. You can hurt us that badly. I mean, you can punch my sister in the face and I won't do anything about it. That's not a family. What is that? That's us right now as a nation. Those people should be in court. I almost said in prison. Those people should be in court. And finally, at the personal level, you can go out and find things that feel communal and good and feel that when you're in that place, people are judged on their own merits and not for their role in society, their position in society. So one thing I've found, I was a long distance runner for a very long time. I was a pretty good runner as a kid. I ran some good times. As I got older, I couldn't run as much and I started boxing. It's a really scary, tough sport. I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at it, but I would say that it's pretty much consumed me. I don't know why. Well, the thing that I like about it, that I really like about it, other than just the insane physical effort of it, which I, for some reason, need something like that, what I really like about it is that at the gym, I go to Mendez Boxing in New York City. It's a basement gym. It's been around for 30 years. You leave your street identity when you walk in that door and down the staircase. You could be a poor kid from Brooklyn. You could be a suit from Wall Street coming to work out at lunchtime. And there's no prejudice, there's no bias in either direction. You're not judged for either. You're judged for how you act. And if you respect and honor the sport and respect the other people in the gym and you work hard, it doesn't matter if you are a Golden Gloves champion or a 55-year-old guy who just took up the sport, it doesn't matter. You have respect. That is a tribal type community. And it's an amazing thing. And it's one of the reasons the poor kids from Brooklyn and the suits from Wall Street all go there and spend a huge amount of their energy devoted to this thing that will probably not pay off in any athletic sense, but it's clearly important. So you can find things like that that operate on those terms that are incredibly healthy.
Got a question. On a recent podcast, you shared your vision for how civilians can better support our troops when they come home. Do you have any tangible suggestions for how Googlers can make veterans feel like they're a welcome part of our Google tribe?
So on my website, sebastianjunger.com, there's something called Veteran Town Hall. And the idea is really simple. It's based on ceremonies that Native American tribes in this country would conduct with warriors who have come back from combat. It's very, very simple. The idea is that people who fight, warriors fight for their tribe, their community, their people. And when they come back, that community must know and deserves to know what that was like for the warrior. And that there's an incredibly cathartic value in the warrior explaining what he or she did for the community. But there's also a real value in the community taking on the moral burdens and the triumphs of the warriors. So they're all in it together. And so obviously we live in a de-ritualized, non-tribal society, but we might be able to recapture some of that. So the idea that I had was that on Veterans Day, instead of the parade, which I don't think parades have high therapeutic value for people particularly, in addition to the parade, the town hall gets opened up. They're not doing business, it's Veterans Day. Gets opened up, and veterans of any war who served in any capacity get 10 minutes to talk about how it felt to serve. And if you say, I support the troops, that means actually going to town hall and listening. And you might be super conservative, patriotic kind of person who really doesn't want to hear a Vietnam vet scream at you for 10 minutes for having to fight a war that he didn't believe in. You may not want to do that. But you know what? He's your countryman, and you paid for that war, and he had to fight it, and you didn't. He fought it for you. You need to listen. You might be a super lefty, anti-war, and you really don't want to hear some sort of young guy saying that his experience in the military was the very best thing that ever could have happened to him, and he misses it. You may not want to hear that, but you know what? He's your fellow citizen. You paid for that war whether you agreed to it or not. It was your taxes sent that guy over there. So hear him out. You may learn something. And everyone might be quite uncomfortable to have someone stand up, and I've seen this, and basically be trying too hard to really talk coherently because they're trying to explain how their brother got shot and killed right next to them, and they should have died, not the other guy. And they have the guilt of survival for the rest of their life. We all need to hear that. And so when you do that, you are basically saying we're a community as a nation, we're a community as a town. The people that have served this country, we honor them even if we disagree with them, but we're here for them and we'll hear you as long as you need to talk, we're here to listen. And that's an extremely important process for both sides.
Thank you. That was excellent response. Do we have any more audience questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. We love all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Please continue making documentaries and books because we definitely will be buying them and reading them. So
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you for sticking it out for the full 2 hours. That's
Yeah.
great. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Let's come around.